as someone who has had HR experience, that's where I started my career after college, moved into corporate training pretty quickly, loved communication, have always been obsessed with personal growth and development, worked at for 14 years with a wonderful communication company called Decker Communications. And that's where I like to say I grew up, because I got to travel all over the world and speak on massive stages at Starbucks, Netflix, Google, all the places, these amazing brands. So I had this wonderful foundation. And then in 2020, that's when I left to start my own thing. And I'm on a mission to reach 10 million women to overcome self-doubt. In fact, I want to eradicate it in the next 10 years. And it's all about, to me, if you could sum it all up with what is the one problem that Karen solves, it's helping people speak up, but particularly women, so that they can get what they want. So that's a little bit about me.
It's so good. I love that you started when you were 6 and your dad is like, don't pay full price. Like the negotiation and communication go together. Like
yes.
that confident communication. That is so cool. And then I think you're right. I love this story about your mom as well. Like, I think as women, I always use the word enculturated. Like, we have this cultural stuff that comes at us.
Yeah.
That we're like, ooh, I don't feel that here, but I feel that out here. And like, how do I align those things? It's really challenging. And I think it shows up in all kinds of ways and spaces. Like, I notice it when I'm on the phone with people. I notice it sometimes when I'm with my kid, I'm like, wait, that doesn't feel like, why am I doing this? That feels so misaligned. So I just think that we grew up with these competing messages, shall we say.
Exactly.
So I want to talk a little bit about what you came to talk about credibility, and what do you see credibility is, and why is it so important?
Well, I'd say that credibility is all about people deciding whether they think you're competent, trustworthy, and really have the chops, as they say. And if we don't have credibility, people don't trust us. So if we look at the opposite side of it, sometimes that's even easier. People don't trust us. They don't take us seriously, which is another big thing that happens a lot is, well, I don't want to digress too much here, but I do think that that's a really good reminder of how can you be taken seriously? How do you get people to listen to you? And when you lack credibility, people don't actually think that what you have to say really matters, or they just don't, they're not fully confident in it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think about with credibility. And so, I mean, I think it's so important. I mean, let's face it, we can all put 2 and 2 together to know why that's important. But if we think about building trust and credibility quickly, or if we think about trust as part of credibility, it's really, do people, are we influential? Do we make an impact? And we always do. The bigger question is it the impact that we want it to make? And I know you're very familiar and talk about this too, about intention versus impact. Wow, well, wait, I said that, but why did they do that? That's not what I expected. So that whole idea too about this all could branch beautifully into expectations and assumptions and all the things that people make up in their heads about you or about me. And people decide very quickly if they like us, if they trust us. And it's interesting because, I mean, we could do a whole granular dissection of likability, credibility, that kind of thing. But if we go back to really, who do people do business with? Those 3 things of know, like, and trust.
Yeah.
That's all connected.
Yeah. Well, I think what's so important about what you're saying is that credibility really has to do with trust. And when the words that we say, sometimes if we think about it, not just undermining our credibility, they're undermining trust. That feels very different. Like, ooh, I want my words and my actions to align, because that's what builds trust with people. So when I was promoting our talk today, I was sharing a story of a really great boss who was so kind to me to say, when you giggle after you give a direction, it undermines your credibility. Yes. And I was like, gosh, that hurt, because I'm funny.
Yes, you are.
I want that part. But I also really wanted people, I was leading a faculty and they needed to understand the importance of it and they needed to trust me. And that was really helpful feedback. Although it was a little scary and kind, it was so helpful. And I know that you really help us align those two things. Like this was an action that didn't align with my words. And
Mhm.
so, what are some of the words that we use that undermine our credibility when we're speaking in a team meeting or even in a larger group of people or a smaller group of people?
Mhm.
What are some of those consistent words that show up and people start to go, even
Yeah,
if they don't consciously think that, they're like, I don't know about that.
right. Well, and I'm going to answer your question, and I want to say that it's the reminder that this goes with how we're actually coming across when we're saying the words that we're saying. So,
Mhm.
for example, let's say if I said to you in a meeting, "Hey Jen, I just want to share a little tip with you." Versus,
Okay.
"I want to share a tip with you." Or just share the tip. "Hey Jen, I've got a tip. Here it is." But just and little are words that we want to look out for.
Mm,
Obviously, they're in the they're in the dictionary. There is an appropriate time and a place for
mm,
each of them. But I notice that this happens, and sometimes we will do that little crouching under, like, or can I ask you a question? Just ask the
mhm,
question. You've already wasted time by asking, can I ask the question? But I would recommend against, well, here's what I would suggest as an action step, because I think we all need those how-tos.
mhm.
If you say just, and the first thing is to be aware that you're saying it. Am I
Right.
saying it? How often am I saying it? And I admit, by the way, I wanted to acknowledge, I always love your humanity, your vulnerability, and the stories that you share, because the one that you shared about giggling, that first of all, it's vulnerable, but it's so relatable.
Mm,
And I think for my story is really about, well, I have many of them where I haven't said what I wanted to say, but it wasn't that long ago that I did an interview with someone, and she was writing an article based on our conversation. She sent Well, I ended up seeing the article pre-printed, whatever.
mhm,
So basically I saw the article in advance. I hadn't heard the recording yet. I was astonished at how many times I said just.
mm.
And frankly, full disclosure, I told her, "Hey," I said, "Julie, I preach so much against saying the word just. You've got to take that out of the article.
Yeah.
Can't have that in there 3 times." But it was such a good reminder. And what I would then suggest is notice if you're saying it, and then ask yourself, is that an appropriate time to
Mhm.
say it? And then sometimes you feel like, oh, I just can't not use the word just. I use simply
Mm,
instead of just, if I want to emphasize something, like I
yes.
simply this, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, that's a good adverb replacement for just, because you're right. There's two different ways to use that in that adverb space, because there is the diminishing. I just wanna, and then there is the simply. I just want to be clear. Like
Right.
I simply want
Right.
to be clear. Like
Yeah.
there's more there. And I have a question. One of the things as um I always want to invite people in to
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
How do you suggest inviting somebody in and asking for permission? Like, I'd like to give you some feedback. Would you be open to that? Kind of rather than just coming in with your information. See, I said just. Like how do you negotiate those two things about asking for permission but not diminishing what you're saying?
Sure. Well, I'll give an example of one thing that I recommend not saying, and then what to say instead
Yes. So
as an
give us the
example.
bad example and then tell us how to do
Yeah,
it.
because
Uh-huh.
a lot of people kind of asking for permission is, does that make sense? Like
Mm,
I know it's not exactly what you were talking about, but
mm,
that's the first thing that came to mind. Then we can come back to the other one. But we'll say things like that, as opposed to, and frankly, the antidote to this is the antidote to most things, and
mm.
that is to ask open-ended questions. So instead of, does that make sense? Because sometimes we say that because we truly don't think that we're making sense. But a better question, because you don't want to undermine your own credibility when the things that you say. So instead, saying something like, what of that resonated for you?
Oh, that's a good one.
Or simply, what do you think? Or
Uh-huh.
probably my favorite question in any interaction, in any communication is, how did that land with you?
Oh, that's a good one.
So that's
I often ask in that circumstance, what questions do you have? That's
perfect.
another one that I'd like,
Good one.
because there's an assumption sometimes about questions that, oh, I don't want to invite any questions. But when I just open that, I'm like, I'm assuming you've got questions. So let's get them out there. It kind of
Exactly.
lowers the bar to that.
Yeah. Well, and I love that too, that the differentiator between what most people do or many people is, do you have any questions? Which
Mhm.
obviously assumes it's a yes
Right.
or a no versus what, like you said, what questions do you have? And that makes that assumption. And that's such a powerful reminder of you also showing more confidence and credibility, I might add, by saying that so that it shows, hey, I'm here. I know you're going to have questions and I have the confidence to answer them. It's amazing all of these things that are going underneath the surface, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things when we're thinking about noticing what we're saying, I always, when I'm working through with clients, I talk a lot about you are unconsciously incompetent at first. Like you don't even know you're doing it. And
Yes.
then you're consciously incompetent. Like I did. And I was like, oh, I just said just, like you start to notice it. And then you become consciously competent. You are actively working through, I'm not going to say this thing. I'm
Mhm.
going to replace it with simply, or I'm going to replace it with something else. Then it becomes unconsciously competent. Like
Yes.
it becomes your, just the way that you talk. It's simply the way that you talk. I'm starting to,
Yes.
the word I'm working on is so. I say so
Uh,
a lot.
Me
I'm
too.
still in the consciously incompetent stage. That one. But so we've got these words. I just did. We've got these words. Just little. What are some other words that we may not, that might be surprising to us, that undermined our trust and credibility?
Yeah. First, I have to say I totally relate to what you just said about the so, because and the other thing that I wanted to say, I
Well,
really
better
want
than therefore,
yeah,
which I do
true.
love a good semicolon, therefore, comma, but most people don't.
One of the things I do want to make sure that we say before anything wraps up here is that the other thing is to be careful for everybody listening. Don't be so hard on yourself. Think about the 80-20 rule. It's I have so many people now in my world that go, "Oh, I just said I'm sorry," because that's another one I recommend not overusing. But
Mhm.
these things are, "Oh, I just said just." So if you're constantly editing yourself, also you're not thinking about what you're actually saying. So have grace for yourself is what I want to
Yes,
say to anybody listening.
very
Okay.
important.
So another one of my favorites is to avoid the word but.
Mm.
And I know
Tell me
that you're a big
more.
yes
Tell me
and
more.
person. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir with this one, but you know the power of yes and. And it is funny though. I also find that a lot of people will use yes and. This is the other thing to be careful about that I've seen sometimes when you yes and someone, but you're really saying it with a but
Mm,
mentality of
yeah.
yes and.
Oh, I'm definitely guilty of that.
What
Yeah.
I find instead of saying but or even and, I noticed this is also a good tip for everybody in your emails. Notice it that
Mm,
usually ending the sentence and then starting with a new one instead of but will make the thing it undoes it a little bit.
yeah, I like that. Because the reason I always recommend against using but, or to avoid but when possible, is because most of the time when you put but there, it negates everything you said before. And
Yes,
people feel it. It's not logical. It's a
right.
feeling. And
Mhm.
that's what undermines your credibility in that way, is everything I just said doesn't actually matter. Here's what I really mean.
Mhm.
Rather than, I think what we're trying to do is empathize and acknowledge,
Yeah.
and then offer a different point of view or another perspective or another idea. I think that's where that idea of a new sentence could come in, or even
Yes.
also we could consider, or
Yeah.
something like that. I think that's a really great way to say that new sentence. And especially, I'm glad that you pulled out in an email, because I think when we're writing, sometimes,
Yep.
especially if you're doing, like, if you get into the SEO thing, they're going to be like, there's not enough transition words. And sometimes they're not helpful. So I like that. Uh,
I want to see another one that we don't think about too often. You asked earlier about what would be one that we wouldn't think about perhaps as being as obvious.
mhm.
The term I think. There is, of course, a time and a place to say, I think this. But oftentimes, where I hear people, where it undermines credibility is when we're saying it with not a lot of strength in our voice. I think this would be a good idea versus this would be a great idea. This would be a good idea. Or if you're going to say, I think, say it like you mean it. I think this. That's a very different feel than I think this. And this is another good thing to keep in mind for people, especially in writing emails, because that's the great thing is that you can control what you send. I mean, obviously we can control our mouths
To an extent.
a lot harder
We're forever working on it.
to. So noticing that usually the phrase I think, or I would say I think and I believe are in similar camps. If you take that out of the sentence does not lose any meaning. In fact, it has more strength. Just like the one that I mentioned a second ago, which was, I think this is a good idea versus this is a good idea. And most of the time, what I notice is people use I think as a way to, they're generally speaking, it's almost like a filler, or they're using it unconsciously that it comes across as less confident. And maybe they're not sure, or they feel uncomfortable bringing up an idea, because it does feel a little bold to say, this is a great idea. Sometimes we feel like we need to say, I think. Again, it's all these things are for consideration. There's no immediate hard and fast, but it's something to think about and be more aware. To me, at the end of the day, it's, are you attuned to how you're coming across and what might be there that you don't even know it, because we all have blind spots.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's that noticing piece that's so important, because there, I think, as I say it out loud, there are times, particularly in a hard conversation, like when I'm working with somebody in conflict, that's a time where it's important to say, I'm thinking this, I think this, where you're kind of owning feelings and emotions versus that, like, 10 men, 1 woman, they're all doing blah, 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 blah. And you're like, well, I think maybe that's a very different space, rather than here's what I think we could do. Here's what this, and that's a different confidence around, I think. So that's, I like how you are talking about noticing the circumstance you're in is a key piece actually to building your own confidence. That's a huge thing about credibility, is knowing your audience and who you're speaking to. So Flavia's got an interesting question. I know we're talking about specific words, but do you have some advice for her in this? You're in a job interview, you're switching careers. How do you show that credibility and confidence in that space and arena to demonstrate your competency? Possibly a new place. I mean, you've done this switch.
Yes. Remember that passion is contagious. And I'll share an example specifically in my career. I had the opportunity to interview to be an HR director, and I had been an HR manager. So it was a nice move for me. And yet I didn't have, I really wanted to move into a more corporate training role. That was not the role, but I really wanted more of that experience. And I didn't have that much at all. I mean, I had a handful of hours, if I'm really honest. But in that interview, I kept talking about, well, what I love about training is this. And I kept focusing on training. So to Flavia, just as a reminder, and for anybody else listening, is that we have a lot more control than we think in the words that we say and how we say them, and that can influence people in a way that almost is like a Jedi mind trick, where it's kind of, so when I did get hired for that role, the CFO said to me 2 days after I got hired, I heard you did a ton of training when you were working at the Gap in their corporate office. All my finance managers are flying in from all over the world. Can you do a training on leadership next week? And I said, of course. And then I turned around and went, holy crap. But I do want to remind everybody that passion is so important, even if you don't have the experience. And the way that you show up with your voice, speaking with conviction, speaking with variety in your voice, showing like you're interested, can make a massive difference. And it goes back to that whole concept that I know there's controversy on it, but the fake it till you make it, or act as if. But when you do that, it shows that you're confident about who you are. And that's the thing that influences.
I agree. And I would add to that is that so much in our conversations is nonverbal. There's so much that's nonverbal. And we've been talking about the words that we say, but also how we say them.
Yes.
I think, and like there is, when you're switching careers, I think in particular, that passion and confidence that comes across in I can do this, they're going to feel that from you,
Yes.
and more than just the words that you're saying. So I think what you are bringing to us is that brilliant idea, and Laura's underlining it, passion is contagious. And when you act as if, and you have that, it's, they feel that even if your words don't know. I mean, that's that alignment that we were talking about at the very beginning.
Yes.
Your words and your heart and your actions aligning all together. Okay. We've gone so far over time. I just noticed the time. We had some technical difficulties at the beginning. Karen, you are always such a delight. Where can people keep up with you? How can we find you? Get your book, get your course. What tell the people how you can access.
Thank you, Jen. Everything stems from my website. So go there if you're interested in learning more. And it's KarenLaos.com, KarenLaos.com. And you can go there specifically to download a freebie called 9 Words to Avoid and What to Say Instead. So that would be the thing I would say. Go get that. I've gotten lots of good feedback on that.
Yeah, it's great. And it's such a great resource. I love that resource because here's the thing that you do really well, Karen. You give fantastic examples of what not to do that we're all like, oh, yeah, I've done that. And then how to fix it. And I think that's what's so powerful about the way that you help and coach and train people. So thank you for your work and your service. And we are here to help you get to your 10 million women. So glad for that. Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's always great to have you whenever I get to talk to you. I always love it.
And since you mentioned the 10 million women, I have to say that if anybody is interested in being an ambassador to help me reach those 10 million women, there are different levels of that, and you can go to my website as well. But right now, specifically, my ask is that I am looking for corporations to partner with me and be part of the mission and social initiative, and it's called 10 and 10.
I love it. I love it. Oh, let's do this.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here. And if you're watching live, you're catching the replay, thank you for spending your time with us. We are here every week to help support you and grow for you and your team. And next week, I am doing a mini workshop training, just solo, on how to improve your team communication. So we're going to be talking about that next week. So glad that you are here, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.